Hi everyone, this is Aaliyah Gray with the Center for Ethics Education at this year's HIV and Drug Abuse Prevention Research Ethics Training Institute. I am here with Dr. John Rendina, Assistant Professor of Psychology at Hunter College, and we are very happy to speak with him today. So my first question for you is, what is your specific population to research, and would you describe this population as vulnerable or marginalized?
Sure. So my work primarily focuses on gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men, who, as you probably know, are the group that is most affected by the HIV epidemic, with really disproportionate rates compared to the general population. My work focuses in particular on HIV-positive gay and bisexual men, and so this is a population who are disproportionately men of color, who are disproportionately individuals that have an experience of mental health related issues, including substance use, and they are a population who experience a lot of intersectional forms of stigma. And so that's a primary focus of my research, is on the different types of stigma that these individuals experience and how those forms of stigma impact their health behavior, their mental health, and their physical health outcomes.
Okay, great. So how would you say that emerging technologies have changed the way research is conducted?
Sure. So, I think that this is particularly relevant for the population that I study. A lot of apps have come out in the past few years, like Grindr and Scruff, as well as the ones for the general public, like Tinder, and even things like Facebook Messenger, that have really dramatically changed the way that gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men meet each other. And so these technologies have, not surprisingly, become a major tool within research to find these men and to help get these men into various HIV-related research studies, whether that be HIV prevention or HIV treatment-related research. I think that the use of technology to recruit and enroll this population has become really prolific, and pretty much everybody does it, but I think one thing that we don't do is stop and think about some of the ethical related issues that this technology in particular can have that might be unique from other forms of recruitment techniques. So, we used to go to bars and find men and give them a brief survey and then ask them for their contact information and call them later to try to get them into a study. That comes with its own set of privacy and confidentiality issues, whereas this new form of technology also comes with its own forms of issues. And so that is actually how I first got interested in studying research ethics, is trying to think about what those different privacy and confidentiality related issues are when we're using these different technologies. So as part of my mentored research project that I did as part of the Fordham Ethics Institute, I recruited a large nationwide sample of gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men using two of these apps. We ended up getting about 12,000 guys to complete the survey. And what I looked at was how their levels of trust differed between online research and other things that they're doing online, like using their email or using social media or using these sexual networking apps. And we found that overwhelmingly the trust was actually highest in online research in comparison to these other technologies that they're using pretty much every day, especially this population who we specifically recruited from some of these different apps and sites. We then asked them about a range of 12 different types of data that these types of apps could collect, and this ranged from basic things like your profile information about your age and height, and got a little bit more granular into things like your HIV status, and then we got into things that were not necessarily data that they actually gave to the app, but things that the app was able to collect or generate on its own. So we asked about things like app-generated location information and app-generated or app collected information about other things that are on the mobile device. So, for example, some apps on certain platforms can collect information about the other apps that are installed on your phone and how often you use them and what kind of operating system you have and all of that kind of stuff. So we asked them about these 12 different types of data, and we asked them how concerned they were about the app owners collecting those data in the first place, about the app owners selling those data to third parties like marketing firms, and about the app owners sharing those data with researchers. We found that in terms of collecting the data, on average, people were concerned about half of the different types of data that we asked about. They were actually a little less concerned about sharing those data with researchers, and quite a bit more concerned about those data being sold to third parties. So one of the most interesting things is that we found that they were more concerned about the app owners collecting the data than about the app owners sharing those data with researchers, which obviously they wouldn't be able to share the data with researchers if they hadn't collected it in the first place. So that was kind of interesting that they did have this higher level of trust in online research than they had in some of these different technologies that they're using every day. The other thing, which was a little bit more concerning, was just the amount of privacy-related concerns that they had about these different activities. One thing that I didn't mention is that we actually generated the list of these different types of data and the 3 different data-related activities based on the terms of use and the privacy policies of some of the various apps that I mentioned before. And so a lot of these different types of data and these 3 different activities, collection, selling, and sharing, are things that people have already granted permission for the apps to do when they agree to the terms of service. But most people don't realize this. And so one of the things that really stood out to me was just that people are very concerned about the types of things that they've already given these app owners permission for. So that, I think, poses a little bit of an ethical dilemma, both more broadly in terms of policy and whether we need to be developing policies around the appropriate way to present terms of service, which, as you know, are long legal documents right now. They're not presented in the way that researchers have been trying to reform consent forms to be over the past decade or so, in terms of presenting the most important information up front, trying to give things briefly, trying to use pictures and other tools to help improve understanding. And the other, I think, big issue, besides just whether we need policies about how to develop these terms of service, is whether we need policies about whether it needs to be all or nothing. So what we found was that most people are uncomfortable with some things, but totally fine with other things. And what that suggests to me is that we need to be doing more to allow people to opt in and opt out of various different things that they are or not comfortable with, rather than making them agree to everything in order to be able to use something. And so, app owners might develop a list of the data that are most essential for them to collect that they will require of everyone, and then they could also come up with a list of things that maybe aren't essential for them to store or share or sell, that people could opt in or opt out of. And some apps and some websites have already started doing this, and I think we do see that some people opt in and some people opt out, and I think it makes it a better experience and increased public trust in these different technologies when people have that level of control, which I think is ultimately what's most important.
Great. Thank you.
Hello, this is Elizabeth Yuko with the Ethics and Society podcast. I'm here with Dr. Sue Fish, who's a professor of biostatistics and epidemiology at the Boston University School of Public Health. Hi, Sue. Thank you so much for doing this.
Hi, Elizabeth.
So you're involved with a lot of things, but I know Primer is one of your main organizations. I cannot remember off the top of my head what the acronym stands for. Could you please remind me?
Sure. PRIMER stands for Public Responsibility in Medicine and Research. It's the international ethics organization that's involved with protection of both human subjects of research as well as animal subjects of research.
Great, thanks. And that is, it's a good tool for IRBs and a good organization for IRBs.
Yes.
And so I think for our purposes today, I think it would be interesting to hear what your take on an IRB's position on encouraging research would be, instead of being seen as a roadblock, how it encourages research. Just, I guess, hearing the other side of the story.
Okay. Well, many investigators experience IRBs as an obstacle or a roadblock, or they think they just have to get the approval, however they have to get an IRB approval. My perspective, and the perspective of many people in the IRB world, is that IRBs have a mandate to protect human subjects, and the way to do that is to help researchers do scientifically valid and ethically sound research. And in that way, I see the IRB's role as helping researchers to do the right thing. Not that researchers are intending to not do the right thing, but rather that researchers tend to get focused on their research goals, which makes all the sense in the world. Mm-hmm. They are not expert in the regulatory requirements, and sometimes they don't necessarily see some of the ethical issues involved in their research. For that reason, a collaborative relationship between investigators and IRBs produces the best results, both scientifically and ethically, and ultimately subjects are benefited and protected.
Great. Thank you so much. So, next question is, as an IRB expert, do you have any tips for researchers for navigating IRBs? Are there any particular red flags they should look out for, any language that they should use or not use when putting together their applications?
Well, certainly anybody doing research that might be listening to this podcast is probably doing research related to HIV, substance abuse, sexual minorities of various sorts. All of those are populations, research populations that may be considered vulnerable to coercion or undue influence because of various power differentials. That said, any of that kind of research is going to raise some red flags with IRBs. If an investigator, in putting together an IRB application, can proactively identify the red flags and try as best as possible to proactively address issues around coercion, undue influence, and power differentials, privacy and confidentiality issues, additional risk issues, benefits to subjects and society from the research, and put those descriptions in the IRB application before the IRB has a chance to raise them as red flags. I would also suggest to use language that the IRB is most comfortable with, and that's really the Belmont principles: respect for persons, beneficence, justice, and then to use any of the regulatory requirements that the IRB must assess in order to approve a study. And those are the review criteria at in the common rule at 45 CFR 46.111 for those regulatory nerds who are listening. But feel free to go ahead and look that up. And then the informed consent requirements at 45 CFR 46.116. But for example, just the justice principle. If a researcher does not include a certain, quote, vulnerable population in his or her research, is that violating the justice principle of fair sharing of the burdens and the benefits of research by excluding anybody who might be intoxicated or might be an injection drug user, because that then doesn't allow those populations to be participants in the research. And if an IRB, if an investigator thinks his or her IRB is going to balk at including a certain segment of the population, not for scientific reasons, but for, quote, ethical reasons, then the investigator can say up front, well, if that subject is excluded, that's a violation of the justice principle. And that takes it right back to the Belmont principles, a language the IRB speaks, and then the IRB has a different perspective on excluding segments of a population that aren't necessarily scientifically justified to be excluded.
Great. Okay, so that really, I guess if researchers do their homework, particularly in terms of the regulations and being familiar with Belmont, then that will really work out to their benefit in the end.
I think it'll smooth the process when everyone's talking in a language that the IRB has to talk in because they're regulatorily bound to meet certain standards. Is once the investigator understands that and can talk in that language, the conversation goes more smoothly.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. Those really helpful tips. And if you are looking for Sue, you could look up her research at Boston University School of Public Health. And thank you very much. Bye-bye.